I just give it a pregnant pause there for it to get going. You see who I am. I've got my Battleship Aloha shirt on in my Jean-Luc Picard country estate here. But because my bandwidth sometimes is snaky here on Aquidneck Island, I'm Oconus, as we joke, I'm on the island side of Rhode Island. And sometimes my throughput goes down. So I'm going to turn my video off, but hopefully everybody can hear the dulcet tones of my FM radio voice. So, wargaming operational logistics forward in peer adversary conflict. I didn't put Wolfpack on because that I get a lot of grief for, because that's supposed to be a submarine game. Like, it can't be like logistics and stuff. But we come up with these things so that we know what to call it and people like it, so it's fun. So beyond bullets and barrels, force generation, sustainment, reconstitution, and pesky humans. Who am I? I'm Paul Vebber. I've been a hobby gamer for a long time. I've done professional wargaming for not quite so long, but still pretty long. I was one of the founders of Matrix Games back in 1999 and worked with them in my copious spare time for a little over 10 years. But since they've merged with Slytherin, I now work as a servant of the government for the US Navy. And so now I just do that. And if you want information about that kind of stuff, you can look at my LinkedIn and you can see more about me. And of course, all the views expressed in this presentation, personal opinions of the author, do not present any national, organizational, or institutional endorsement. For those views would be boring. And sometimes I'm the wide-eyed kid of wonder, and sometimes I'm grumpy old man saying, "Oh yes, I remember when I was a young lad and I thought those things, but I grew out of it." Well, wargaming, part of a framework of research activities and a process for assessment with analysis and exercises. I operate to the best that I try to do. We try to get our analysis folks and the exercise shop folks to at least be aware of what each other are doing, and we pretend like we actually pass information around like it were the cycle of research. And when we make a process out of the things, we call it either the cycle of research assessment process or just cycle of assessment, just so we can make it a little bit distinct and have inputs and outputs, because people like me like to have inputs and outputs. For my particular case, in what I do, war games typically equal board games played by multiple small groups repeatedly over time. So we get in a week-long event, we don't have 70 people all divide up into groups or divide up at all, play a single big thing. We try to get small groups of 4 to 6 or 4 to 8. Once you get to 8, we try to like split up into other groups of 4. But it depends on what expertise you need on a side. But we try to get, if we've got 40 people, we'd rather have 5 4-on-4 small games going on with some, maybe some slightly different, at least different choices made by the players, maybe a few little tweaks in the scenario. And the goal is to either have these things be like half-day things or full-day things. For this particular piece, this is, trying to get a, hobby like war games, board games done by non-gamers and non-military people. A lot of times it's a tough thing to try to do, but it's this idea of gaining insight into what works and what matters in conflict with a peer adversary at various scales. When we talk purpose, are they educational? Is it analytic? These are educational games. They have a little bit of analytics to them. We try to collect some information about uh, the, but it's mostly what are people choosing, not, and you try to get to why are they choosing it, but a lot of times it's just, here's a scenario, here's a half a dozen things tools in your toolbox you can pick from. Uh, we A lot of it is just experiential education, what giving people this safe to fail environment to try things out and to learn about the bigger picture of what their often very specific little role is. And I've got some objectives there. I won't read them all out, but the broad thing is, I say, a lot of what we do in wargaming, particularly these kinds of war games, is why do I believe what I believe? And when am I willing to put those beliefs at risk? And how do I deal with people that have differing, that disagree with me? The ever popular arguments phase. And to channel my inner Phil Purnell, the dialectic, something new coming out of reasoned debate versus the strict didactic about presenting you with information that is taken pretty much as facts. And then there's a little bit of both. Okay, operational logistics. When I did my other brief that talked about operational level war game, naval war games, operational level of war is problematic in the maritime domain. We get this sort of a conflation with operational art and activities that people do, and the weapons and sensor coverages and the ranges over which things move can be so big in some cases, but yet very small in others, that the reach and scope issue of what's tactical and what's operational when they overlap so much gets squishy. So we're talking about logistics in the sense of getting stuff into theater from exterior bases and arranging the stuff in the theater where it can statically be, and then where you have to load it up into ships and cart it around places. When we talk about some of the analytic things in this kind of a game, part of it looks at, everybody poo-poos the old, we used to do the Iron Mountain, Operation Desert Storm, the Iron Mountain brings 75 gazillion things onto a base. Now we like to look at this, just-in-time logistics and logistics as a service and all these information-y, predictive analytic-y things that tend to be not as resilient, maybe, because they strive for efficiency, and something that's 100% efficient tends to be not very resilient because it's easily thrown off. The enemy unexpected creation of demand by doing stuff. How does that play into all this? Again, and the scope and scale issues. I get my little letter things, Russia, there but for the grace of God go we. We like to think we're, really good, but it's been a long time since we've done a lot of this stuff too. And you get, some of this stuff is, just because you can do it, and I think this is sort of bit the Russians, just because you can do it in Syria with a half a dozen brigades doesn't mean you can just seamlessly, effortlessly scale it up to hundreds, to scores of brigades and hundreds of battalion team. It's like you don't have the scale grow, the ability to do that for that, just because and we in the Navy, we like to think because we could do it once, we can do it 50 simultaneous times, and maybe we can, and maybe we can't. But that gets to the no shit actual major theater war against military peer adversary versus the day in, day out civilian peacetime bureaucratic mindset. Who, when, and how does this shift occur? That's a miracle. So we like to think, oh, there's all this stuff. When the war comes, we'll turn our hats around and there'll be all this stuff that we do. It's like, okay, who is making this decision about when we turn our hats around, and what are all these people going to be doing, and how are we going to explain the stuff that we're suddenly not doing that a minute ago was super important, but now people aren't going to do because it's war? Well, again, exposing people to those ideas. We're not going to solve them. There's a whole lot of people that they don't even see that kind of stuff. So forward, not just an away game, but figuring out which game. When does it start? Whose rules do we play by when? Why do I go second? Can I go first? Is there a game I can play before the other game? Is there a game I can start on the side that starts doing other things? And who's on my side? How much can I trust them? For how long? We like to think of, oh, well, it's forward. Well, we're getting to have the ranges of a lot of stuff gets to where rear areas, including the homeland, are vulnerable. And the bad guy in his backyard, proximity, that's got some advantages. So, we have a whole bunch of ideas about how we're going to deal with this. A lot of them feature distribution. It reduces risk to force, but maybe it increases risk to mission, because now I have a lot harder time talking to myself and each other. I've got a lot harder time coordinating, and the time distance of being in the right place at the right time. If you're meeting after work to go to a party, it's a lot easier if everybody, sees each other in the elevator when you're leaving work, and you all just have to go to your cars and get a short distance away, or everybody's on Teams and everybody's at home and tens of miles, everybody's got a half hour to 45-minute commute, and everybody's going to arrive. When's it easier to get everybody to arrive at exactly the same time versus in one situation, versus the other? It's just inherently more difficult when you're distributed. A couple other things here: risk defeat in detail when it fails. If everybody's off by themselves, they only will ever find one of me, and only one of me will die. But that poor guy, alone and unafraid, when he gets found, that's not necessarily, that's a tough thing. And then you've got the sustainment issue when you look at fuel and ammo. Again, I kind of use, I'm not my usual pedantic self of the logistics versus sustainment, and I throw them around a little interchangeably. But generally, when I talk about sustainment, I'm not just talking about purely fuel and ordnance, but also to that extent to which that there's an ongoing assessment of what the plan versus what my logistics situation is. So it's like logistics in motion over time creates sustainment. And I know there's all sorts of mortuary affairs and doctors and all sorts of stuff in the doctrine book, but my Paul Vebber's vernacular logistics is kind of the static, how many missiles and how much fuel do I have. Sustainment is the orchestration of all the moving parts to get it from where it is to where it needs to be. And that gets to this, there's a great book. It's up in my little beginning here, Operational Logistics. Great book that has a lot of interesting things that I found very useful. And a key thing in there is this idea of carrying versus obtaining versus shipping. And then I add storing and assembling. And that can lead, the storing and assembling can lead to expeditionary production, where I'm doing, I got a nice little picture here of these guys that took 3D printed poles and things and foam and made a little raft out of like stone knives and bear skins and got across the way. The obtain piece, there's some interesting articles out about the new foraging, which brings to mind these sort of pictures of people going into Walmart in some little podunk place in the some country and buying everything. We need the combat contractors. It's like the battle lawyers and the combat contractors out there, making sure that we get simple things like having enough water and having enough, bug spray and stuff that when you're out far forward in hot, steamy places that are far from the comforts of home, if you don't have, you lose a little bit of capability when you're trying to live amongst the elements without any comfort and support. Peer adversary. Russia's in the news a lot, but for us Navy guys, it's China, China, China. So they have a competitive scope, and they're in the middle of a regional to global transition. They've got an ascending power mindset. Some other thing in this, naval emphasis supporting mercantilist economic growth strategies. They're, they think it's 2030 going on like 1888 in some ways. We like it because it harkens back to the Navy's last great success. What is the, we've done lots of stuff as a force provider for the Air Force, or we've had some things we've done. But as far as this sort of thing, this major theater dust up with a peer, with someone similar to us, is World War II. Which side are we on, and what role do we have today versus World War II? And there's some questions there that bear some consideration. On a good day, we're all well and good, and for us, just because it didn't work in the past doesn't mean it's not going to work for us. Especially if this idea that some fundamental characteristics or character of war has changed. And a lot of people seem to be banking on, in the land of the blind men, the one-eyed man is king. We're going to get the information and everyone else will be just, wandering around. But if they're practicing fighting in the dark, there could be some advantages to that. And these kind of things, they're, when you play the theater level kind of a abstract game like this, you can't bring too much out of it. Like I say, it's not strictly analytical. It's the game mechanics and the things are a little too squishy to be too analytic. But there's some, as you get into playing around with the role of information and sort of just doing some little worker placement mechanics of putting some limitations on having to focus where and when you try to get some of these advantages, it gets interesting. So there's been a huge amount of talk about, well, war game, but once you get the war game objectives, a miracle occurs, and then all the game design stuff all falls out of it. I'm like, where are these sponsors with all these objectives? I've been kind of bringing up in a couple things. It's like more often than not, we're trying to help educate the sponsors to become more war game savvy. And that takes a lot of effort. And, there's a lot of hemming and hawing back and forth by some of the folks on here and other folks. There's been articles lately about, what's a war game? We need to be more specific about what a war game is and what it's not. And others people are kind of, well, as long as we're performing activities that are achieving their intended goals, then, a rose by any other name, or is it, and then you just get, well, Rimpac's a war game, right? It's like, oh, not the way we talk about it. But yeah, thank you very much, Washington Post, for, so there's getting too pedantic about what is and what isn't a war game. There's times it's really important, and there's other times I found it gets in the way. But back to these ideas and objectives. So when the folks who asked me to help them, the questions they were asking that they thought I might be able to help them with a game about were these issues of force generation, looking at these long-term maintenance training and operating cycles, how you get theater, like where do we put the logistics, the maintenance capabilities, can we abstract, what, without the parts thing gets way down in the weeds really fast, but can you sort of abstract some categories of parts and categories of, the parts that and to get us some of these things of, well, here's the part sets that my predictive analytics say are important. And then here's a bunch of guys who do battle damage assessments say, when you start taking missile and, when gun bullets start going off, here's the kind of things, there's parts, those kind of parts. And then, you kind of put these, and then there's well, I'm operating for long periods of time at sea. So there's just the, salt water and thumping against the ocean is an enemy in and of itself to metal parts. And there's a bunch of things that satisfy, and the thing is, you don't have enough space, and you don't have enough to put all the parts within each of all these categories. So how do you prioritize them? So those kind of things. And they were a little bit about this, third-party basing relationships. They just didn't want to wish away and say, well, we're just going to assume when the war comes, everybody's going to just say, yeah, come on in, you're welcome. We are not afraid of the big bad gorilla over there that threatens to smash our nice things because you're here. So there's these long-term things. There were some short-term things. So when you do this theater position, so it kind of what sort of came out of here was there was a pre-game or a pre-conflict thing of setting the conditions of the theater, which I've got a little picture here of sort of the extent of the map. And then the idea that you have to live with your decisions in this pre-conflict phase once the war comes. So how do we look at ordnance expenditure rates, the dynamic, fuel movement maneuver, damage? How do you look at some missiles and you're like, yeah, you get hit by one of those things, and there ain't a lot of, maybe you might get a little cannibalization out of it, but it's really going to be hard getting something hit by 2,000 kilogram warheads back in the fight. And part of the thing gets to, if you go back to this issue of force generation, there's where things are in these interdeployment maintenance and training cycles mean that the standard wargame assumption that all my game pieces are full up rounds is wishful thinking. I've got, different, I will talk about, categorizing things and what that means. And then some battlefield effects during the engagements, that these are nice to have that we talked about, but pretty much in the interest of time got thrown out. The idea of friction and some of these human vigilance, the fact that there's you can't stay at GQ for an entire week. And an interesting piece here was people always bring up a lot of people I work were in the technology and engineering, and like, how do we know if we're getting a Mark 14 issue? The Mark 14 was a World War II torpedo that was basically broken, but everybody in the engineering side blamed the poor, training of the ship crews of why it wasn't working, and they didn't want to admit to a serious flaws in the actual operation of the weapon. So when do bad die rolls, tired crews and enemy votes, when do you start, and what do you kind of, if you're out in a war, what kind of information do you have to collect to sort things out into, well, these things didn't work because of this category, but boy, here's a whole bunch of them that sure seems like it should have worked and it didn't. What's up with that? And of course, all this stuff, and we want to play a scenario of the game in 8 hours by folks who don't know really wargaming because it's educational, and who don't really know military planning because they tend to be like engineers and analysts and things. And that gets you to throwing your hands in the air. It's like, how do I do this? Well, I call it's sort of my game design mantra, is this thing about creating a schema, a mapping of the game world to the real world. And how do you abstract, how many black boxes or rushing nesting dolls in each area of these objectives do you open up and dig down into? And how many, and with knowing that every time you open up a box, it's design time figuring out what to do, and it's play time because now you've given players decisions to make about what's inside the box. So a lot of times keeping the box closed both makes it easier in game design, but sometimes requires it to be more because it's a higher abstraction level. There's sort of a formalism or hopefully an elegance to it, or at the very least a not a breakdown that the way you've decided to represent what goes on inside the black box isn't just completely crazy talk. So this rapidly brought us to basically a 1.5-sided game where the players are blue, dealing with blue's logistics problems. If you have an active red side, that's some significant number of people playing in the game that aren't really getting anything towards the objectives that people want to get out of it. And where do you find them peoples that know a lot about red and can quote unquote play a good red game? And it became pretty clear that focusing on the blue side, abstract the Chinese red side into kind of a response mechanism. And there's a lot of good, I looked at, there's a solitaire card driven thing for some of the, what's the, not Company of Heroes, but Conflict of Heroes. Yeah, the solitaire. So I got some ideas from that, and some other things, and created this idea that you're kind of putting the blue players. They're not military planners, so you can't really make them try to come up with good, sound military plans. So you kind of provide them that and make it a victory point machine puzzle to harmonize these different supply and demand issues. Now, the blue, this how long is the long part of the game? And a typical operating cycle for major task group units is on the order of 36 months. That's a little long, but essentially looking and dividing them into these different categories that at any given time you'd find your force into, you get the players to deal with this fact that, gross simplification, about 40% of Blue's force is fully mission capable at a time. 20% is in deep maintenance of some kind, and the other 40% is variously in these training cycles. And so how do you represent that kind of partial capability, and the fact that there's a lot of thought going into, well, if we have a period of time that we can try to throw resources at, how do we, is it better to take a guy that's really close to being fully mission capable and topping him off? Or is it better to get a bunch of people that are only partially capable, at least able to be sort of, good, they could fake it and at least defend themselves, if not maybe being really great coordinated attackers. And then are there ways to increase this fully mission capable percent during a crisis? Or are you just kind of robbing Peter to pay Paul? And it's like, there's a lot of these questions where when you go to set up the specifics of the game, you set based on what actions you give the blue player to in each turn, and what how many they can, and sort of what the trade-offs are. You can sort of set the rheostat on, well, we really think it's much more a rob Peter to pay Paul. So you've got to steal readiness basically from one unit and donate it over to another unit, rather than a rising tide that somehow floats all the boats. And if someone, and then you have a discussion, and a lot of this, I use a kind of a quasi matrix format where I try to elicit a lot of player discussion, and try not to have a too specific. I have more of a player's guide for this than a rule book of, SPI, kind of cases of, 3.4.5 says you get 2 chances at 20% each to get a ship mission capable. Well, where does that come from? And who do I negotiate with to change that number if I don't think it's right? Well, we have we have the recriminations phase when the players can go and address the things that they think the designer screwed up. Then in the also this aggregate de-aggregate of some of the logistics pieces, and looking at permanent versus expeditionary basing. So I lifted this notion of a 2-phase construct from Sea Powers. That's a game of naval technology development pre-World War I. Peter Perla, Al Nofi, Chris Weave, a little bit of playtesting by me, that back in the CNO Strategic Studies group in 1999. I can't believe it's been that long that Sea Powers has been floating around. But one of the things in that game is there's this mechanism of, there's a rising tension mechanic that inevitably leads to war during this pre-war period, where people get to make a bunch of decisions about things. And, in that case, it's, investing in a whole bunch of cool technology versus actually building some ships. And when the war comes and you've got all this great technology in your pipeline, but you never actually built them into any ships, you suddenly look down at your shoes, and hopefully you can deploy a lot of minefields and protect your borders. And this idea that the players live with these pre-conflict decisions when the war comes. All right, Chris is working on a new edition or edition. I think you meant edition, but hopefully it has additions. Okay, so more on this schema idea. So activity, mapping the game world to the real world in this crisis-y road to war kind of phase. What is it the players do to get at these issues in that we've sort of codified as some objectives here? So we have basically there's actions you can take in a couple different areas. There's this track that either submarines or surface ships are in these various boxes. When they're in these various boxes, they the boxes represent their material condition, and they also have a training value. So you can either train them so that when you get the ability to increase the material condition, they can take advantage of it, or sometimes you just get the things so they can safely get underway and get them out there, and hopefully the enemy won't be able to tell your good stuff that can actually fight versus the demonstrators that are out there looking proud and being loud, but hopefully not being attacked. And again, two of each, and there's sort of a base percentage, and you can, if you really need to get something done, you can expend both on one and increase your probability of it working. Same thing with these other things. So you can get these construction projects. So around, there's all these different areas. And I got these nice little pictures of the islands. People can see, well, Palau. Okay, there's an air base on Palau left over for World War II, and this is what it actually looks like. So you're going to put 37 P8s at that. Okay, it's like, where? Look at the little picture and tell me where they're going to fit. You're going to be building some Chinese-style island extensions off into the neighboring reefs to put that, what you want to put there. So it's just some little idiot checks to just let people see what they're talking about at some of these places. But the idea that I can create or upgrade fuel or ordnance storage, I can upgrade, change how many air bases, each level of an air base lets you base another air squadron there. Similarly, port facilities, you add more cranes. There's like, a bare bones thing, you get one crane and it's more better. You got another Lycon that's got two cranes that's even more better, and that's how many task groups it can resupply per week, per turns a week. And then this idea of deploying and repositioning expeditionary advanced bases of various kinds. And then these partner security activities, getting access to places to either put my EABs there, or if there's a very nice base that's already there, get access to it. This notion of doing exercises, the whole idea, part of this is to get people to think about some of these notions of like theater security cooperation. And, there's some critics out there that are kind of like, we've kind of broken the Navy on the back of this notion of theater security cooperation, and what exactly has it done for me? Well, I like to try to look at good news over bad news. So I give you this idea of, if you're doing exercises with supporting people, they help give you this quote unquote non-kinetic support. So whether it's however you want to characterize it, it's secret sauce that supposedly you get by operating together. Or the other thing you get is you operate in an area, and part of the idea of operating in an area that might be important is you understand what goes on there, and so you can get get training and work hard with the people that you're working with, or you can focus on getting knowledge about the environment that makes it easier to find things. And particularly with undersea warfare stuff, it makes it harder for the other guy to find your submarines and easier for you defined as submarines. There's some diplomatic things that if you want to play some manipulation games, sometimes you want to get the war on. So sometimes it's the war's about to start and you need one more turn. So the idea is that you can play some games with the tension if you succeed, but if you lose, then you've sort of maybe pissed off some of the locals that you've been working all these secret sauce supporting things when you lose one. And the other thing is, part of that foraging, you contract tanker support. And then there's this, as you do each of these, for each one of these things you do that's successful, you draw an event card that has some sort of either a red or a rest of the world response. So I like to think in the schema thing of, sort of the operational factors of time, force, and space. So we've talked a little bit about sort of the, what the actions, what is it blue does to try to get what advantage to show that they've achieved something. Well, fundamentally, there's going to be these task groups that are going to be moving around using all this logistical stuff. So what do the units look like? And focusing on task group, CSG, CSG, SAGs. I think the download, I've got this presentation on my OneDrive, and there are some notes, little notes and things that if you don't know what CSG is, a carrier strike group, and there's some things in the little notes page that it's like a carrier and a cruiser and basically a SAG, three or four ships, and submarines generally operate alone, but just to keep the counter density down, I organize them into groups of 3. Particularly since each area is about 500 miles, the idea of 3 submarines in 500 miles is not too outlandish. And a lot of the unit, like what the game pieces look like, I borrowed from the Marine Corps Warfighting Lab, Marine Corps University operational wargame system series. And that's good because you can just kind of look at a unit and you kind of see, here's little icons that show sort of what domain it has a capability in, and then it uses this sort of a rank ordering of capabilities by die-sidedness. So you have 6-sided dice, 8-sided dice, 10-sided dice, up to 20-sided dice. I've even got 24 and 30-sided dice if you want to play, to get that more dynamic range for playing out in the future. But as you either to show an increase in capability or to show a combat the combat multiplier or some kind of a degradation, you can promote and demote the dice, and then ultimately you have to roll the die you end up with and equal to or greater than some defensive value in order to quote unquote get a hit. So it's very organic. The players see it immediately, and it keeps everything unclassified. You get sort of the general rank ordering of these things are, China's missiles are like 10s and 12s, and yours are like 8s and maybe some 10s, and theirs go long range and yours don't. And at the level of this kind of a game, with the time we have to play it, that's about where it's about enough black boxes and little Russian nesting dolls to open up on that. So on the space, the board, the game board, the play area, where you have to be to fight, but also sort of there's these range rings based on some of Chinese capability that say if I'm way out, like past Guam, out in the middle of nowhere, it's relatively safe. And then as you move into that middle area, sort of between the first and second island chains, it gets a little sportier. And if you go like actually into the South China Sea or the East China Sea or thereabouts, things can get pretty sporty. So the 500-mile area kind of works pretty well, where two of these five within two of the Chinese coast is kind of like things can get bad really fast there. Sort of there's another two area, another the next 1,000 miles basically takes you out to Guam, and you're not it depends on how you set the scenario up, how much risk there is there. But if you're, and as you'll see when I kind of show the map, that out past there it's just boxes, and you're just so that you know how far it is to move in some of these places off the edge of the board, and how much time, it's the time versus fuel thing. If I want to move a lot of areas in one turn, it's going to cost me a lot of fuel. So I've got to plan out my rotations of things in, forward and to the rear, both to rearm and refuel and repair. And it's like I said, that gets to be the puzzle of the victory point machine. And it's a nice 500 nautical miles in a 1 week turn is a nice convenient speed fuel relationship. So these in 6 weeks of turn one, you could basically move anywhere to anywhere. But there's this idea of spending time at sea that gets at some of these security cooperation things. But if you spend time at sea and you sort of forego little availabilities and things, you can end up being degraded to a lower material condition. And we talked about the IPOE markers that you get for staying at sea. Okay, so now phase two. So you do these, you've got these different things you do, you buy and sell, you take these actions, you draw cards, and sometimes I'll show you some examples of them in a little bit. But the big thing is there's a little box that shows you the sort of the tension level, and when the tension level goes into the war box, you transition into phase two. And then the turns, instead of being about 6 weeks, are 1 week. And the big thing there is looking at how you construct this part of the game. It has, this part is easy to drive, and there aren't that many decisions. You get analysis paralysis of people hyper analyzing, but typically when you get people that are learning the game, you get a couple plants in you just kind of go, okay, like let's get a basic strategy of kind of how we're going to approach this. We're going to focus on distributing our fuel and ordnance, so we're going to do that one a lot. We're going to upgrade port facilities, and we're going to really rely on the Air Force and tankers, and we're not really going to worry about local air bases too much, or expeditionary advanced bases. And we love secret sauce, so we're going to try to get lots of extra non-kinetic support dice, and base access be damned, and we'll always lose tankers, so we'll get half a dozen more tankers to have, because you never, at the second half of the game, you're always running out of fuel. So we've got these an 8-hour day, an 8-hour target. So if you look at phase one being just about a 30-minute intro, if you assume you've got everybody to do the preparatory work, you've got my goal is I get 2 people per team that have sort of play tested the game or gone through a walkthrough of the game. So the other, say, 4 people, so they can help husband them through the sequence of play, and help them at least in this, like the first playing in the first few turns, get to a battle rhythm going. And then 3 hours of phase one and then a lunch break, and then phase two is about 4 hours. So that gets you to about six-week turns in phase one. Sometimes the war comes before that, and then you can start early. And the nice thing about phase two is the key thing at the end of phase two turns, red rolls to see if their campaign advances. And you can make that that's just a time. You set the timer, and that die gets rolled every 20 minutes. And if the player's not quite done with their turn, okay, but that turn now they're in the next turn, and they didn't finish that turn. So that seems to work pretty well, because when they get the 5-minute warning, all of a sudden a whole bunch of decisions get made for good or ill. And they also, in the games we played, there's kind of, you need an operational at about 4 to 6 turns of fighting. They tend to like to front load things, so there's a lot of high intensity stuff that happens rapidly, and then they find they've got to take an operational pause, depending on the attrition. They've either got to figure out, they've either busted their plan for fuel expenditure or busted their plan for ordnance expenditure rate, and they've got to either at the very least take a pause to sort of get those rates back in sync. So as I said, it's about a week turn, so 7 days, 500 nautical miles is about 2 areas per 6 knots of speed. You kind of have things that go, normal speed is 12 for a lot of stuff moving around, so you can go 4 areas. You can go fast at 18 knots, and then 24. Submarine, typically I only let the submarines go like 30 knots, because there's almost you're almost never, you're going to run out. You try to go 30 knots for 7 continuous days, and you have to stop and do an unrep in there somewhere. Even if you are going 24 knots, you're going to be pretty close to out of Schlitz when you're at the end. So you probably want to stop and, somewhere and top off. And it's nice because basically, if you do have to get stuff back to CONUS, because there's if you get a carrier that's got more than half its damage points, the only place you can fix that is back in. You can fix one of them, and you can fix one of them in Pearl. If you get a second one, you got to send it back to Bremerton or San Diego or something. And this gets to these decisions regarding the standoff for the strike rating and the fuel. So if your turns typically in the combat phase are you run in, execute some missions, and run back out to minimize the opportunity the enemy has to get shots in. So speaking of that, I use kind of a Firefly mechanic. If you're not familiar with Firefly, there's a mechanic where as you move across the board, every time you move into space, you draw a card. And the majority is like 2/3 of the cards just say keep flying, maybe half. I don't know the proportion. It's half or more just say keep flying. But then the other ones, there's a thing that happens. And so about 40% of the cards activate some kind of a red response. And based on things, though, the cards, there's 3 sets of cards. There's different groups of cards that when blue does certain missions, or if red suffers too many failures in a row, then you start adding more catastrophic, from blue's point of view, red cards in. And that gives you the nice thing about sort of the card driven red is you can construct for different, if you have different sets of people playing different games, you can basically stack the deck. So if you got 3 groups playing, they all encounter the exact same sequence of red counterattacks. because they may have done things differently. They may or may not be activated, but at least you can sort of set some, you can sort of do a master scenario events list sort of structuring of how, so that the blues aren't playing radically different. Here's a red. Well, hey, the third turn of the game, the nukes start flying. Well, wait a minute. No, those don't come in till the end, when red's like not seemingly winning, and blue attacks the president and tries to knock them back to the Stone Age. Then the nukes come out, or whatever, however you want to do it. Let's see. Again, like I said, the 500 nautical miles, 7 days, you get about a quote unquote a fuel point, 1,500 barrels. So console tanker is about 200 points. An AO is about 80 points. So I call AO ship fill a strategic fuel point, just so you don't have to move when you're moving the fuel points around and carrying them in console tankers that carry basically like 2.5 fuel points. Instead of having chits that have to add up to 200, you just have like 2 nickels and a penny. And I love, where can you get metal 2-sided 5/8 inch game markers for free? Or at least for a cheap rental price that you can get your money back. I have a big bag of spare change that I use for fuel point markers and all kinds of different markers. And then, how much a CSG, I just track the cruiser. If you have, typically the CSG, you'll have a SAG bolted onto it to be what's a normal CSG. And these kind of show you the SAG's got 20 points to go. 4 movement points per turn cost 6. To go 8 is, if it's going to go 10 and go 30 knots, oh wait a minute, 28 is bigger than 20, so it's got to hit an AO somewhere during that move and spend a movement point to refuel itself. And even 16 out of 20, now you're getting pretty low. So how's the space part, the game board part? I started out and I had this map from another game I was using, and for a bunch of reasons, this was a little too busy. So we ended up going to this map that has that like 4 hex boundary, where there's like hexagon areas inside this basically 2,000 mile area, and then everything outside that is boxes. It's still 500 miles. It's still 500 miles, like to go from where that looks like Wake Island up to like Minatory Shima is 1,000 miles. So it's 1, 2. So that would be, if you were doing your fuel, that would be, that would cost that amount of fuel, and you could go, you could go there, do some missions, and go back, and that would be your 4 moves for that turn. Or you can go farther back, and if you use a bunch of fuel, I mean, you could almost go all the way back to Pearl and go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and whoops, and then come back 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then we're looking at future stuff. So, and to simplify some of the things, so this is an experimental map that has 250 mile little increment things, because one of the problems is the space, you lose a lot. There's a lot of rounding error in these 500 mile things. That is, people want to pay more attention to the fuel thing. It helps to get a little more granular, but then that takes more time. And the other thing is focusing this idea, we'll talk about in a minute, of blue mission cards, and make it very apparent where on the map you need to be to use certain kinds of mission cards. And as you go to a future where you start having both sides have really long range weapons, and you can start doing standoff strikes. Blue can start actually has weapons with ranges that these precision super long range hypersonic things that it can start countering the A2AD by sort of establishing its own long range A2AD about stuff coming out, and then just being able to strike from outside the easy ISR envelope. But this needs some more development yet. So right now, this is what I've been using. Like I said, I've got nice little pictures of air, like these are like the different airfields in the Philippines. I've got a little box here that shows what they look like. The little islands in the South China Sea, they show what they look like. And then the little Pacific islands that variously get talked about. Various, we're gonna put an air base and a port and 5 billion gallons of fuel, and it's like, wait a minute, like where's that gonna go? Like, even looking at Diego Garcia, poor little Diego Garcia is not really that big. Okay, the force piece. So unfortunately, the good news is so far we've talked a lot about like fun stuff and kind of optimization problems and stuff, but how do you keep track of this? It kind of comes down to like a spreadsheet. So at least one of the players, typically you get 6 or 7 people on the team, there's at least one person that doesn't really want to play the game, but boy, they love spreadsheets. And that person, you give them the spreadsheets. And I print these out, and it shows, for critical munitions, how many of the different critical munitions they have based on how many things they have. And then, basically aircraft markers that represent the squadrons that you could use once per mission that you do. And then the bad news, it's like, well, here's all the spare weapons that you've got. Because if you familiar, the operational wargame system convention is that a die, when you roll a die, that's somewhere typically 8 offensive missiles and 12 to 16 defensive missiles. So like this is like 48. This little counter here represents 48 LRASMs. And like if you go in and read the little like congressional thing that says like how many we're buying, it's like based on how many we're buying, like that's like your share. Like you could maybe if you want all your eggs in one basket, you could maybe put like 4 LRASM markers in one carrier, and then nobody else gets any. So that's part of, but you get a fair number of like JASM ERs. But as we'll see, there's certain things, these can do things that those can't, and these can do things that those can't. So what mission you're going to do matters. And so these are basically just trucks for carrying the different weapons. And it's how many you can, and then since they're almost all strike fighters, I can either have them do strike, or I can have them do cap, or in some cases I can use them as tankers. And a similar sheet for the surface groups. And there's a log. So in playing, recording the game, each turn, you write down where that is, where it's going, and follow, and you get a nice little thing that shows what you're doing each turn. Now, to really get this going in 20 minutes a turn, there's a lot of scribbling that happens really fast. So if you really want to record the game, then you probably have to say we're going to take 30 or even 40 minutes per turn and play less turns, but be more deliberate and collect more information about it. And to the extent that you are more interested in an analytic, there's some questions I want to answer, and I want a record of the gameplay to help me answer them. If I'm more into the experiential piece of putting the players in a time constrained stressful decision-making environment, then, and it's okay if, you know, there's a couple turns where they forget to fill this out, then a lot of times that's okay. And here's when it's all set up. Here's an example of like what it looks like set up. You've got what's available at start. You've got in all the box. You've got the sort of the basically the reinforcement track that shows where things are in relation to if you were to play this out over months and months. Eventually, these guys in maintenance, like, you know, 6 months later, would ramp up and ramp up and ramp up. But the question is, in those like 6 months that you have in the crisis phase before you start going to 1 week turns where you can't manipulate this track anymore, what can I do to, you know, is getting these guys up into this box or getting these guys, you know, out fully mission capable, and then make decisions about, okay, these guys have reduced capability, but I'm going to send them off on the board anyway, or I'm going to try to make the roll to, you know, again, there's a lot of things that, and then you start out where there's kind of Iron Mountain, you know, Pearl Harbor's got a bazillion bunches of things, and Guam's got a bazillion bunches of things, and there's some stuff in Japan and some stuff in Okinawa, and you can see where if that's where you keep all your stuff, this stuff's pretty safe, but not 100% safe. This stuff's pretty, you know, there's a lot of stuff Red's got that can go in and start knocking these little markers out. So, and this is, I just didn't have it because when I was doing this in an online thing, the graphic with all the pictures on it was so big it slowed everything down. So I took the pictures off for just doing this as an online thing. So that's why there's very few pictures on this one. Okay, some force generation stuff. I'm already, I can't believe I've already been over an hour, but I got 2 hours, so I got about 20 minutes, and then we'll go to the question, the Q&A. So I got to step things up a little bit. I'm not too far behind. So the, you know, pesky humans. There's I use a rating, sort of a readiness A, B, and C on the task force markers that are in these boxes. So typically things that are in this maintenance box, just they're like, I put them in there and we can have discussions about trying to get them out. That's like hardcore maintenance. Like in a matter of weeks, you're going to be real hard pressed getting stuff put back together again to go to C out of that box. So you're pretty much talking about these guys in kind of, you know, they're mostly in a good material condition, but the crew has gotten a whole bunch of replacements and guys have rotated on and off, and they don't work together as a team, and they haven't operated with anybody else. So they're in this kind of intermediate phase. You get guys that are in advanced phase where they're better. They're doing training, working with other ships, doing complex operations together. And then you've got the guys that basically in sustainment, and they're the guys that were on deployment that have come back. And if you read all the, you know, inter-operating deployment cycle stuff, then there's supposed to be lots of guys in here that are just, they were on deployment and they came back and we're keeping them ready to go. And for some value, that's true. But whenever there's a guy that falls out of, you know, one of these guys can't get his act together and falls out, then typically one of these guys ends up getting tasked to go back out on deployment. So that we're not trying to make you be a force planner of interoperability of the inter-deployment cycle, but just to represent the reality that when you play this game, only these guys and these guys are your full up rounds. These guys back here are variously not quite soup. And if you get to the point where you've got to be digging into here to bring guys out, you got to have some pretty serious discussions about how it is you're doing that and what you're giving up and what you're not doing. Cannibal, I'm basically taking dead guys and cannibalizing them to try to get these guys working and stuff like that. And that's where kind of the matrix game, discussion kind of thing comes in, because a big part of this particular game was just getting people to think about all the dimensionality, sort of all the different moving parts that go with this, just this part of representing the war fight. So you get, typically, so like if you had 10 CSGs in your inventory, one's getting its reactor. It's like not even in the thing. So you get like 4 that are A's that are pretty much full up rounds, 2 that are B's that they're capable of collective defense and they can make piecemeal attacks, but they can't do big, super whammadine cross domain intra-distributed stuff. That takes a lot of training that these guys haven't done yet. And then you got your C guys, they're basically self-defense only. They can make an attack if there's like a guy that's basically, again, they could attack a guy that's looks like it's about to attack them, but that's about it. And then these poor guys, they're just not mission capable. We had some talk of CAS reps, and depending on a little detail in the time, again, one of the great things when you do get players excited is, players become designers and like, well, we can put CAS reps in and we can do this, we can have, the different parts of spare parts and repair and it'll be great. And it's like, yeah, and it's going to take twice as long to play a turn. So we've had talks about representing some of these more maintenance and damage repair in a more specific level, other than just demoting them down to from an A, and they take damage, they become a B, and they take damage and they become a C. So the events. So when you do things in phase 1 and you do these different activities, you draw a card, and they've got a potential increase in the tension level, and it'll have blue moving something. So in this case, there's a +2 tension level increase, and you take some red units out of their ready forces and you put them out on the map. So this is how like red forces get out on the board. So there's Senkaku crisis. So they put a CSG and ESG into the Senkakus, and the tension level goes up by 2. You can for moving subs, you can move up to 2 subs in. For each sub, you roll a 10-sided die on a 4 or less. So if you get lucky, if you move 2 subs and you get good die rolls, you can counter that tension increase. But probably if you send both subs, you probably get 1. You'll degrade. You'll only go up by 1 instead of by 2. And since it only goes up 6 steps, a lot of these are only +1s, and the die roll to counter it is higher. And then there's it'll say the Chinese force generation will advance on a certain die roll. Sometimes it'll say no, they'll like anti-US protests in the Philippines, so no US actions in the Philippines this turn. So when you go to if you draw that card, if there were some of these things, you wanted to do some exercise with the Philippines, you can't because they're all being US. And similarly, they can be anti-Chinese protests. And then sometimes there's just, sort of a die roll contest if it goes up or down, and some more specific things that provide so some gray zone things that provide China extra, basically their non-kinetic die. They get a bonus non-kinetic die added in, so show that they're, or they can activate some decoy units. And then kind of like Firefly, some of them are, there's just a typical boring news cycle. And then there's, automatic, like nothing you could do about it. The bolt from the blue, the tension level goes up because, they can miss. We were all ready to go, except we told the president we were ready to go to war. We weren't quite really ready yet. No force generation, but blue can't do too much, but the tension level goes up and we get close to war. So in phase 2, the cards are a little more specific, where when blue does a mission, and I'll talk about those in a minute, there's, red, it'll show some forces that get taken. And the key thing is the red forces on the card need to be available in the pool that red has. As blue does missions, he's going to degrade and kill ships and send aircraft into the regeneration box. And if you don't have enough forces, you get what you get. If you don't have any of it, then basically the card doesn't work. One of the things we recently added was, this whole thing of trying to get at some of these non-kinetic, almost like it's a little worker placement sub game. And I won't go into the details of that right here because I talk about a little bit later. But basically, when you roll a bunch of dice, you can put them on the chart. Whoever has the more dice gets die promotions, demotions to their or some other effect based on which one it is. This increment of red forces, just like blue has, unlike blue, red doesn't like operate in real nice cycles. They've got like a big gaggle of stuff, and a small part of it, they have it ready, and then a lot of it is just not ready. And whether these things that add an increment, so you get like the South Sea Fleet, they left the O out. My South Sea Fleet starts out with an ESG, CSG and ESG, some Pathum guys and some subs. When you get a card that says add increment 1 in, then these guys potentially become available, but every turn you still have to roll to place them in the available box. So it's like at the very start of the war, red's going to activate the forces that it has for the war. Typically, they're going to get the stuff and at start and increment 1 pretty fast, but this stuff in increment 2 and increment 3 are going to take a while and are not going to be fully mission capable when they come in. And so we talk about blue missions. One of the big issues with this kind of a game, when you've got big theater muscle movement forces, is unless you've got military guys that like have thought this through, I can explain you the rules for how you roll the dice on the little pieces, but it's like, what pieces do I move where? Like what to do what? Like how the conceptualizing of a scheme maneuver to achieve a military objective and operational art. It's like, yeah, that for this scope and scale, it's like, just tell them what to do. Just give. So we came up with this notion of these O-plan cards that basically, rather than blue having to try to come up with what they're going to do with their forces, we've got this abstract red campaign, and for the for turns 1 to 3, you have these 8 cards that you can choose as missions you can do, and you expend the number basically for each, like there's the number of campaign disruption points is the same as the number of these ordnance tokens you expend. So if you expend 2 ordnance tokens, you can get up to 4 if you expend all 4. If you only can get 1, you still get 1. But that's quote unquote performing a mission. And they can be deep strike, offensive counter air, joint war, it's a joint offensive counter air. Well, deep strike stuff has it scores points, and it also disrupts land-based missile attacks. So by doing these, you get lucky, you can destroy some, otherwise you move them into the regeneration box, kind of like aircraft, they go hide, so they're not available. If the red picks a card, you do the strike, you chase some of the DF-21s back in their hidey holes, and that if you pick a card and it says, oh, DF-21 strike, they're like, yep, nope, they're in their hidey holes. You don't have to worry about that one this time. Similarly with the OCA strike, we'll put fighter bombers in timeout. Joint war at sea strike will sink ships if they're out, or chase them out if they've gone from, if they've rolled to be in the pool of at sea assets but aren't actually, a card hasn't said to actually move them somewhere, you can still hit them in port, and then they go chase back into the increment where they go back to they got to roll for them again to get them out of refloated, or to fix them, or whatever it is. Again, try to show these effects as gross things to this abstract campaign, but at least 3 of the 4, the deep strike, the joint war at sea, the OCA, have these ancillary effects that also help take enemy forces off the table from attacking you back. And then just the interdiction is that's just the interdicting the campaign. It doesn't do anything else, but it'll either say you've got to strike a target, you've got to have the things firing all these dice worth of stuff have to be in range of a target area, or they have to be in a firing area, assuming it's going somewhere else. And again, the goal here was to keep it abstract, but to provide this flavor of, there's these different campaigns that Red is running, and that there's actions, the O plan missions are a combination of these of countering these different Red campaigns. And we kind of streamlined them a little as we looked for the future version where there's more different kinds of weapons. So this is like the today fight. If we want to play with, prompt conventional global strike things and all sorts of prisms and hypersonic air launched whammadines, you can start adding those things that now have longer ranges that you can shoot from farther away. And now you start keeping track of the campaign. So you get salvos per campaign disruption point, and they're based on the different kinds of missions. So a lot of numbers in all this. So what we do is we give the play. So blue's never, it'll take a whole day to just figure all this out, just like what the plan is. So we prompt them and we give them a sample. So we give them a preloaded plan for the first 6 turns, and they can either just follow that till they get into it, or they can deviate where they have to. But what ends up happening is, so each turn, the Red campaign advancement roll is a 14 on a 20-sided die. So the assumption is that all the rest of the joint force is doing 6 campaign disruption points a turn, degrading it down. it increases 1 each time you make that roll each turn. Each campaign disruption point is basically a die roll modifier. And once you get 5 successes, red wins. The max you can degrade it in any one turn is 12. So there's always a 10% chance. And every time, every box goes up one. So like once it goes up to the next box, it's a 15, then it's a 16. But if you get to turn 12 and red hasn't won, then red has to take a strategic pause and they reevaluate their retirement plan, and blue wins. And again, I'm starting to run out of time, but there's some optimal play. Give them enough. There's a base game munition thing that gives you a total number of campaign disruption points that you kind of end up where you should win as blue, but there's this whole thing of some players, they like to get off to a good start and they try to front load and get high degradation in the first few turns. But now they're using a lot of fuel and a lot of ammo. Other people are like, well, let's just kind of see how this goes. And we'll do some stuff, but we won't do the deep strikes, because that when you start hitting the mainland and taking out their rocket forces, then even more bad things get triggered to get added in their pile. So, we'll just stick with doing these. We'll hit their islands and we'll sink some of their ships and maybe do some interdiction. But we're not gonna. We'll see if they get off to a bad start or not, and then we'll go from there. But then there's some red cards that like sabotage fuel or target oilers, or there's because there's always the that thing that the nice thing about having a card driven system like this is you can have or not have, depending, you just don't put some of those cards in the deck if you don't want to, or you can say, hey, you got indications that there's the Okinawans for Oconomowoc are threatening to blow up the fuel dumps at the Okinawa bases. So what are you going to do? And then you have a discussion. Is simply a threat like that enough to make me move out, or do I just say, well, I'm going to have to move some more Marines in, and I'm going to get an ESG underway, and I'll move an ESG in there and call it a day. And then we go, okay, well, you did that. So now if that card comes up, because you put extra defensive forces in, there's another +2 on the die roll to see if it works or not. And that's where you can get kind of having this be a little squishy, and you can evolve it during the game as the players come up with good ideas and things. Gets fun and interesting. And so we provide them some initial logistic support plans. Say, okay, in the first 2 turns, here's missions you have to do, and here's where you have to do them, and here's forces that you're going to do them, and here's where their bases are and where they have to come from, and they can just kind of step through this for like the first few turns. And then we've got a planning spreadsheet that says, here's all your, based on what you have, here's all their critical munitions, and based on how many markers, here's the burn rate, and here's, so as you make these decisions about front loading or not front loading, or do I want to stay far away and use lots of fuel, running really fast, really far in and out, they can look at these spreadsheets, and it's easy to compute sort of what you can, by changing the numbers, it'll tell you like what you have left and what you don't. And then it's a question of how do I adjust where it is on the board so that it's available to me. So that's Wolfpack. Let me go back and through some of the questions. Oh, lots of questions. Awesome. Okay.
Yeah. So Paul,
yep.
As you answer the questions, for those who will be watching this later on YouTube, can you just read the question out loud for the
Okay,
recording as you read them.
sounds good. So Matt Evers asks, where's the money? Is financial material cost a factor that can be wargame to explore resource trade-offs, attainability, and schemes of resiliency over efficiency? Yes, but at a severe cost in complication and time and homework to figure out what the costs are. We tried to look at the trade-offs in attainability and schemes of resilience abstractly. And it's like, okay, you can sort of say that based on the limitation, sort of what these player activities are, like you can only upgrade, you get 3 construction attempts. And we say like you can't do more than 2 of any one. It's like you can upgrade to, so if you want a 75% chance of upgrading a airbase, you can use 2 of your 3 construction project things to have a 75% chance of this turn of increasing your airbase capacity. Well, the problem is if you start actually get like you look at the our plan for Palau, like where we're actually going to do this, it's like a 7-year plan. It's like, oh, okay. And again, it's the the day in, day out civilian peacetime bureaucratic answer versus the we really think, no kidding, we're on our way to war. How does that change a lot? Some of the where's the money stuff. So we tried to focus on effects and, okay, are we ever going to have a thing where like 6 months before the war, we're getting all these like unambiguous warning things where we're going to do all this? Well, oh, who knows? But for to make it a game where you can have people consider this, you kind of have to throw the MacGuffin and say, well, if we don't, if the war gets popped on us by surprise on Tuesday, then none of this matters. But a lot of people want to think about if we could do it, sort of what, what's the relative importance of, taking base, increasing how many squadrons I could put at bases that are there, adding new expeditionary bases in new places, adding, storage of weapons and fuel, and realizing that I do have a financial constraint that I can't just say, well, you know what, I'm going to have 57 new ordnance storage and 5 new full up Iwakuni style air bases. And, it's like, no, like, so we've tried to balance a rational kind of a plausible amount of stuff to go on. And so far, like we've played it half a dozen times, and this, 3 projects of these kind of things with this percentage thing seems to work pretty well. And Matt also asks, what are effective ways to working personnel and material evacuation and regeneration, such as mass casualty combat industrial base ramp ups? The personnel and material evacuation, we've just kind of tried to show that as, again, if I start the game with a bazillions of stuff in Guam, I've got to get, and I've got ammunition ships that can move that. I can load it all on ammunition ships and I can just leave. Or, well, it seems kind of, these other ones are pretty close. So if I move it back here into these guys, Chuk Lagoon and back to Kiribati, there's maybe just pushing it back so it's a little farther and more easily defensible. That may be good enough. So we're trying to look at the decision making about disaggregation without trying to get into too far in the weeds of the actual, like what it would take to actually execute that. You're the Navy Expeditionary Command, and you've got to actually, got to go and move, 700 Tomahawk missiles somewhere. Well, and the industrial base ramp ups, we looked at industrial base ramp ups, and it's like, okay, you look at how much stuff we buy and what the production things are, and it's like, okay, in this pre-game thing, in a 6-week turn, you get 1 Larazum marker, 48 Larazums. And that's like if you go to 3 shifts a day on like all the things. And you know, you go to a 1-week turn and now you're like, yeah, I get like 1 die of weapons per week. Like, but how do you, and there's a whole bunch of questions that a whole bunch of people are asking about what's the realm of the possible. You know, it's not like Ford can, you know, stop making, you know, cars and start making Tomahawk missiles. So that's again, that's kind of part of the pregame about how much, but basically what we do now is like, I just have a big die roll table. So like how many weapons you start with. I've kind of taken those colored glossy DoD books that say how much we're buying, and then say, okay, roll a die plus or minus 40% over the, you know, next 5 years. And then we start the game with those excursions off of essentially what we out in public say we're buying. Matt, does that answer your questions on those things? You can't answer me because you don't have a mic, but hopefully it does. Rob Crandall. Hey, Rob, great to see you. Hope things are going well for you with Matrix. Are these games you play once and learn the lesson? Can they play it over and over? We definitely try to play them. Okay, I'll read it more closely for the people that are listening in. Question: are these games that you play once and learn the lesson to be taught, or are they played over and over to explore the range of logistical options available? Is the point to discover the logistical package that meets the most likely needs you can predict, or to predict what you will need in the first place, or both? It's kind of neither, because again, we're not typically, we don't, again, it's the homework thing of like how predicting how much of these weapons and like how much are you actually gonna, like when you execute these missions, you know, so sort of the whole supply demand rate. It's like a game, the game economy. When I talk about it's kind of a victory point puzzle, you know, the victory, the currency of the victory points is very squishy. So we tried to make it tractable and plausible and not necessarily one for one realistic. So it's the decision making about the interaction between these time space issues of I've got to, you know, I have aggregation, disaggregation, and sort of the rate of expenditure against how sort of and I get some indications of how things are going for the enemy, but even that's kind of artificial. Like, how do I really know that they're 1 point away from winning, and not 2 points away from winning? So again, abstract, artificial, trying to get at the big muscle movement ideas in this, and not so much trying to actually come up with, this isn't about planning for the actual war. This is about thinking about the sorts of interrelationships between these logistical factors in a situation not too greatly unlike a major theater war. Jim, what's the advantage to or purpose for having the players plan a phase 2 1-week turn in 20 minutes? Seems like logistics would be a more deliberate process that requires enough consideration to ensure forces don't inadvertently run out of fuel and weapons. Part of it is being experiential. We're trying to deliberately force the players. We give them a plan. So part of it is the first few turns, they're a lot of times, in fact, in every case so far, they've just executed the plan we've given them for like the first 3 or 4 turns. And then as red starts interacting with the plan, they either physically can't continue with the plan, or they see that they need to do things slightly differently. So the point of the 20 minutes is, one, we want to a perennial problem with these kinds of games is that they're intricate enough that you never get past like the first 2 weeks of the war. So we want to get out past the first month. We want the players to be like, I've got these unlimited fuel things back in San Diego. I've got to get fuel guys back. I need the, oh geez, I should have got another console tanker because I got to get 80 strategic fuel points out of my my sump back in Conus and get it back into theater so I can get on with phase 2 because I don't have any. I've got weapons, I don't have fuel. Or we kind of give you sometimes if you get a bunch of weapons, we don't want the players because they've made a bad decision or get a bad die roll. And it's like, oh, well, Guam got slicked and all my stuff's gone and now I can't win. It's like, well, no, like, we'll play Ukraine. Like, okay, the Brits give you some tomahawks and the French give you some things that act like, and we let them flow some more weapons in, but it's like, well, you got to go back to like San Diego or Bremerton to get them, or over to Naples, or because we've got the other side, we've got going off this edge of the board takes you over to Djibouti and Naples and eventually over to Norfolk. So again, a lot of the advantages of a white cell, the sort of a blue side challenged by the white cell is the white cell can manipulate red and manipulate some of the extracurriculars to so that it's not, so you don't end up with a dormy thing where, okay, it's turn 3 and I have no way to, I can't win. So the game ends. And when you really start getting it, when you put a timer and you've got like 4 or 5 people on a team, 20 minutes is enough time for them to come to a decision basically about, do we keep going with the plan or do we deviate? And if we deviate, what's the like 2 ways we're going to deviate? And then, hey, update the spreadsheet. So Colin Darlington asks, how address game logistics support to allied task group and individual ships, especially if those ships are part of a US task group, especially when the allies are deployed into theater from elsewhere? For right now, we just have limited this to the US ships. Technically, since in most cases you're operating as these task force markers, and we do, like when the task force gets attacked, we go and break out the, where's the, we get the blue versions of kind of the operational war game system pieces. But for the most part, we're not trying to teach them the differences between classes of our own ships, let alone the difference between classes of our ships and allied ships. It's just kind of a, here are the quantization of the spreadsheet that says, the CSG, because there's this many of these kind of ships, they have this many of these kind of things. And if your DDG flight 2 gets sunk, they're almost never paying attention to, that was the one that hadn't shot yet. It's like, no, we're not trying to get into that level of detail. So you just kind of, uniformly take them off the top when they shoot. And if somebody gets sunk, then kind of say, okay, depending on, there's some white cell judgment about how to account for that in the accounting of the critical munitions accounting. So I will admit that that's a punt. and there could be a lot more that could be done to represent the logistical, both the value, the synergies, and the disconnects between allied supply chain, the interface with an allied supply chain. So at this point, we just kind of say, like, when blue starts getting in extremis, you get allied, you get extra ordnance that you need from quote unquote allies.
Hey, Paul, what was the question for that?
That was the how to address allied task groups and individual ships. So basically, how do you integrate allied stuff, like, you know, Australian and Japanese and British and French and cats and dogs. Like I said, we're just focused in this case on the blue stuff. And you could, there's the hooks are all there to add other stuff in. It just adds, you know, more pieces, more complexity, more things to manipulate, which means longer turns and more. So you get fewer, you get a shorter time. You know, there's always this trade-off between, do I want to skim the wave tops of what's happening each turn, but get to these sort of operational pauses where the players have to make big decisions about sort of, you know, I just gotta stop, because I gotta stop and wait for stuff from way outside the theater to get in so I can start going again. Are in-theater dry docks included? Okay, so that's abstracted in these little port markers. Are little so these port markers basically for there's a basic level that allows you to basically it's like I can refuel and rearm one task force per weekly turn. If I add a crane, that kind of shows now I've added a repair capability. Could be it's not explicitly taking care of dry docks, but, you know, inside the little, you know, the Las Vegas rule of counters, inside the little counter, there's a dry dock in there that you could put a ship in to get the repair. And then you add, if you upgrade it again, you have a marker with a second little crane, and that you can do 3 task forces rearmed and refueled per week, and you could potentially you could have two major repair activities. And again, when we get to that point, we kind of have a discussion based on what it is that's happened and what the circumstances are. And then we have it's kind of a matrix gamey discussion about, well, where is it feasible to send that guy to where he could get fixed? You know, he just ate 4 YJ-18s. He's lucky he's living. How do you account for expending and rearming critical munitions? Can players move critical munitions from damaged ships to undamaged ships? How do players react when they go down with the? Yeah, like I said, they get this, they bring the spreadsheet and they argue for points on it. Well, I should be able to, this guy, he should have only used 5 and I lost 12, and you should really give me 4 back. It's like, there's, like I said, every team's got that spreadsheet guy, gal that loves to, you know, their fun in the game is, you know, and optimizing the spreadsheet. So the again, the expending and rearming is like, this is when you execute the mission. You've got the blue mission. When you execute, you have to show where these are coming from, and that gets to like, okay, like where, like this guy, and we just put the, like I said, I've got stickers with these things on pennies, and we just lay them out and say, okay, this CSG based on the spreadsheet has this amount of stuff. So I'm expending these 3. And what we end up doing is we just leave these little pennies on the map, because in my actual map of this is like 4 feet by 6 feet. So this is like a really big map. So like pennies, like each one of these hexes is like 6 inches across. So having a stacks of pennies in here is not that hard a thing. And then we use the spreadsheet as kind of a double check. And I could, I don't think there's ever been a game where we actually properly, where at the end of the game, the pennies on the map have exactly matched the spreadsheet. But okay, you're off by, what's 50 or 100 tomahawks amongst friends. And they definitely, well, it's both when they get down with the ship, and if they, I built up a spot back here. I moved the stuff out of Guam and I moved it to a sea base up by Japan, where I think it, where they're gonna have to overfly Japan. So I give them some extra credit for being there, and then we move it back to Chuck. And then Red has Red generates the dreaded super Whamadine SSGN Wolf Pack and has a bunch of cruise missiles and shoots it. And I love yours rolling the dice. Like, come on, I need a 4 or less. And we always invariably, Weber's law of conservation of probability, there will be somebody that will refuse to roll a particular die because they got screwed by that die, and that die is out to get them, and it rolls bad. Despite everything they know about probability, they're, games are about beliefs, and people believe that dice remember to be mean to them. How is the blue player sequencing, prioritizing between sustainment and combat? Is sustainment supporting combat actions, or is combat stressing the sustainment plan? Even a great sustainment plan will fall apart once ships in combat are damaged and require parts, blah, blah. This is definitely the combat is stressing the sustainment plan, because we basically give them the sustainment plan of slides like this that show, like, well, here's where to get off to a good start, here's how you have to move. But it doesn't account for the red responses during that time. And what the game, well, what's the game? Is it just on rails? Well, no, because the game goes off the rails usually by the 3rd or 4th turn, and the players start having to adjust. And a lot of times we'll go, okay, we need like a 20-minute timeout to like rejigger the plan. And it's like, okay, I'll give you, we'll give you like 2 timeouts during the afternoon when we're doing to have, to get the plan back on track. So that's and we definitely, like, when ships get hit, we have the discussion of like, okay, so that ship is damaged, and what ship is leaving the task group to tow it back? What do you mean? Well, the ship's like barely afloat. You got to take another ship and have it tow it back to somewhere. Well, where's it going? So, oh man, it's like I lost 2. It's like, yeah, this is like the old thing of, the sniper never tries to kill the guy. He always tries to wound him, so then he can get his buddy to come out and try to save him, and then he gets to get another guy. And it's like the same thing kind of happens in here, where China, and I sort of have some stuff in the Chinese deck where they definitely have some card combinations that snipe at casualties. And then the return to a ready status is this thing of, okay, I've got, like, where do I have a port with crane? And so, and then you basically roll the die each turn, and based on, we come up with a number, something to say, okay, like, you got a 10-sided die, you got to roll a 4 or less to get repaired this turn. And it's like, oh, it took 3 turns to fix it. It took 3 weeks. Yeah, that's 3 weeks to fix a ship that got hit by a missile, get it back in the fight. That's maybe even outside, that's being pretty sporty. Okay, I'm about out of time. I was pretty good about 90 minutes to my presentation and 30 minutes to questions. So I feel pretty good about pacing this all out, and hopefully you've all enjoyed it, and kind of see at least one guy's impression of how to deal with this in a way that you can actually get, it actually works. You can get people to do it and they have fun and get frustrated. And all right.
Hey, Paul, one last question is, when are you going to
Yep.
run this for Goose?
When I'm tied up till the end of September, but like after maybe in like November.
Sounds good. I'll keep you to it.
At the very least, we can like play a sort of a partial online kind of thing. I talked to you, or we talked a little bit about trying to get someone to like put this in Vassal. And I've just not had time to really, and so at some point that would be the optimum way to do that. Because being up here in, like I said, being Oconus on Aquidneck Island up here in Rhode Island, 2.5 miles over the bridge from the mainland, it's tough for me to get down to DC.
Yeah, no
Although-
worries. Well, follow up with my Vassal dude and see if you can convert your latest version into Vassal so you can run it for us. But on behalf of Goose, I want to thank you for your time and your expertise. And I'm going to pick your brain more about this when we meet at Connections next week. And for those who will be at the Connections Wargaming Conference next week at IDA, feel free to say hello to myself and Paul and many of our other colleagues from across the DoD as we meet for our annual Wargaming Conference in DC. And I want to thank everyone for their wonderful questions and great ideas. And hopefully you guys all have a good night.